Okay, so you know how climate change is constantly in the news? It's almost just there in the background.
Yeah, it's become part of the daily conversation almost.
But the UN, they've been flagging some, well, bigger. They call it the Ewing.
Triple crisis.
Exactly. Climate change is one part, sure, but it also includes biodiversity loss, like the sheer variety of life dwindling.
And environmental pollution, which covers, dirty air, contaminated water, plastics, all that stuff.
Right. And while we probably feel we've got a handle on the climate change part,
Or at least hear about it more.
yeah, the other two, biodiversity loss and pollution, maybe feel a bit less immediate. Or maybe less talked about in the same breath.
And that's precisely why we need to, really dig into this concept of the Ewing, because they aren't actually separate problems. They're tangled up together in some really fundamental ways.
Okay.
Understanding how they feed off each other. That's crucial if we want to grasp the real scale of what we're facing.
Absolutely. So to help us get our heads around this interconnectedness, we're looking at a conversation with Professor Choi Jae-chun.
Ah, yes. A leading ecologist, fantastic science communicator, too.
Right. This chat is from his YouTube channel, Odara, which kind of translates to, So What? Climate.
Hey, yeah, it's a great title. Very direct.
It is. And the conversation is just really accessible, a good way into these big, sometimes complex issues.
Professor Choi has this real skill, doesn't he, for weaving together these different environmental strands that maybe seem separate at first glance.
He really does. He brings so much knowledge, but also like a real passion for making it understandable.
Which is so important for these topics.
And, for me, this isn't just academic. My daughter was born last November.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks. And while thinking about the world she'll inherit, Korea, the planet in the 2040s, 2050s, it could be drastically different.
It certainly focuses the mind, doesn't it?
It really does. Makes you want to understand what's actually happening and what, with anything, we can do. So let's unpack this yaga, this triple crisis, using Professor Choi's insights.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start? Maybe with the politics. Professor Choi brings that up pretty early on.
Yeah, let's do that. He talks about the lack of focus on these huge environmental issues in Korean politics.
Right. He contrasts it quite sharply with Europe, where climate and environment are often major election topics.
But in Korea, he noticed it in past elections and kind of expects it again. These things just don't seem to get much airtime from politicians.
It's pretty striking. He even mentioned trying to get presidential candidates onto his channel.
Oh, yeah. To discuss these things directly.
Exactly. But he said there was a real lack of interest. Apparently only one candidate didn't participate, and ironically, that was the one who ended up winning.
Wow. That really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Are politicians just underestimating how much people actually care about this?
It's a good question. Because Professor Choi points out this sort of disconnect.
How so?
Well, his YouTube data shows huge interest from the public. Climate videos getting hundreds of thousands of views consistently.
So people are seeking out this information. They are concerned.
It certainly looks that way. So why isn't that reflected in the political priorities? Maybe they think other issues just play better with voters.
Could be. Or maybe it's a miscalculation on their part about what people really want to hear about. It's puzzling.
It is. But okay, let's pivot slightly and actually define this Gale beat more clearly. For anyone listening who's maybe thinking, all right, I get climate change, but what's this biodiversity loss thing again? And pollution. Are they separate?
Good point. So yeah, beyond just temperatures rising, biodiversity loss is about the decline in the sheer variety of life. Fewer species, less genetic diversity, ecosystems becoming weaker.
And pollution is, it's the contamination. Air, water, soil, plastics, chemicals. All the harmful stuff we're putting into the environment.
Right. And Professor Choi points out that historically we kind of treated these as separate, localized problems.
Exactly. Like, oh, that factory is polluting that river. Or there's a wildfire over there. Specific events in specific places. Then climate change came along, and it was undeniably global. It grabbed everyone's attention, and rightly so.
But the side effect, maybe, it was that it overshadowed how interconnected it is with everything else.
That's what Professor Choi suggests. The intense focus on climate change sometimes made us forget, or maybe just not emphasize enough, how it links to biodiversity loss and pollution.
So the IJO framework is really about saying, hey, these three things are happening together. Climate change drives biodiversity loss, pollution can make climate change worse, and so on. It's not just about the heat.
That's the core idea. It's a system. And while the UN focuses on these three: climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, Professor Choi even floats the idea it could be called a JOIM.
A multiple crisis.
Yeah, because arguably lots of environmental issues are tangled up. But these three are seen as particularly critical and globally interconnected. That's why you hear terms like triple planetary crisis. It emphasizes the scale.
Global, not just local. Okay. Now, Professor Choi, he's seen how this plays out internationally too, right? He was involved with the UNFCCC.
Yes, starting in 2018, he became a UNFCCC champion specifically for biodiversity.
And what was his experience like in those early international meetings?
He said he was actually quite surprised initially. At these big climate conferences, the discussion was almost entirely about climate change in isolation.
Really? Even though climate change directly impacts ecosystems and species?
Apparently so. He found that biodiversity loss wasn't really a central theme in the main climate talks back then.
So what did he do? Did he try to change that?
He did. He really pushed to highlight biodiversity loss, arguing that its consequences for humanity could be just as severe, maybe even more immediately felt than some aspects of climate change itself.
And how is that received?
Often with surprise, he said. Like, people hadn't really considered it in those terms within that specific climate-focused setting.
But things have shifted since then.
Definitely. He mentioned seeing a positive change over time. His advocacy, combined with, the mounting scientific evidence, started to make a difference.
Okay.
International bodies began increasingly discussing climate change and biodiversity loss together, recognizing they have to be tackled in tandem.
That's encouraging. So we're seeing that reflected now in things like the COP meetings, this idea of integrated action.
Absolutely. The understanding that these crises are linked is much more prominent in the global discourse now. Even as Professor Choi noted, that shift isn't quite as visible yet in the day-to-day political discussions within Korea itself.
Right. The international conversation seems to be evolving, even if domestic politics lags a bit.
It seems that way. And, Professor Choi also shared a really interesting story, maybe a sign of hope, or at least changing perspectives closer to home.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He talked about some young entrepreneurs in Gangnam. They're involved in blockchain technology.
Okay. Blockchain and the environment. How does that connect?
Well, initially, they created something called climate change coins. The idea was, I think, to use their tech ventures to somehow contribute to environmental causes.
Interesting approach.
But they ran into a bit of a wall. They found that just talking about abstract numbers like carbon emissions wasn't really grabbing people. It felt maybe too distant, too technical.
Yeah, I can see that. It's hard to feel a personal connection to tons of CO2 sometimes.
Exactly. So they pivoted. They started thinking about focusing on more tangible things connected to biodiversity.
Like what?
Ideas like a biodiversity coin or even a polar bear coin. Something more concrete, more relatable, maybe more interesting, frankly.
That makes a lot of sense. People connect with animals, with nature they can picture. Does Professor Choi think that's a wider trend, people engaging more with the biodiversity angle than just climate metrics?
He didn't explicitly say it's a huge trend, but this specific story, it suggests that connection is powerful. People relate more easily to the living world, perhaps. And this shift in their thinking actually led them to Professor Choi. They got interested in his biodiversity work, sought his expertise.
And he ended up speaking at one of their conferences.
That's right.
That's quite telling, isn't it? It shows there's this growing awareness, maybe particularly among younger people in innovative fields, that the environment isn't just about climate change.
Yeah, they're seeing the bigger picture, the interconnectedness, and looking for ways to engage with that broader set of problems.
Okay, so let's try and bring it all together then.
That was good.
This Ilinjura, the triple crisis, it's not just a catchphrase. It's highlighting that climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution are fundamentally linked.
Deeply interwoven, yeah. And focusing only on one, like climate change, which we tend to do. Well, it gives us an incomplete picture, maybe even a misleading one.
And Professor Choi's perspective really underscores this worrying gap between apparent public interest in Korea and the lack of political focus.
Right. But there's also that hopeful note. The international conversation is shifting, and there are these grassroots efforts, like the blockchain example, showing a broader understanding emerging.
So ultimately, understanding this interconnectedness, it's vital for all of us, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It helps us see the true scope of the environmental challenges and why we need action that addresses all these fronts together. Comprehensive, integrated action.
Which leads us to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. how might things change if we all had a deeper understanding of biodiversity loss and pollution, really integrating them into our thinking alongside climate change? Could that shift the public conversation and maybe eventually political priorities?
And perhaps think about your own life. Where do you see the connections between these three crises playing out? Are there examples right there in your community or daily experience?
Yeah. What links can you observe between climate, life's variety, and the pollution around us? Something to think about.